In the letter to the Hebrews, there's a great deal said about this man, the high priest, and how Jesus is a better high priest. It's appropriate to think about our links to these early Jewish believers. And on this particular day, which is 20th of September 2020, as Jews and Messianic Christians are celebrating Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, because they have a different calendar to us. But for them, it's a time of reflection, of repentance. And as I was hearing the other day, the shofar, the ram's horn, sounded at the start of the festival on Friday, and it was sounding again at the end of the festival, sunset today. And this is really a week for them where they, this weekend, celebrate this particular feast, also known as the Feast of Trumpets. It leads to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And of course, it was the Day of Atonement which was significant for the high priest, because that was the one day of the year when he was able to go into the Holy of Holies in the temple to offer sacrifice, to pray for the people. The Day of Atonement marks this day when the high priest entered the Holy of Holies in the temple. And there's a great explanation of both these festivals actually on the Jesus website. What I want to think about this morning is the high priest of the Old Testament and how Jesus is superior. This is what the writer to the Hebrews is constantly pointing out to these early believers. So what about the Old Testament high priest? What were his duties? What were his qualifications? Well, there's three things he had to fulfill in order to be involved in this work. First, he had to be called by God. He was called by God to act on behalf of the people in their relation with God. He sort of interceded between the people and God and the people. He had to be sympathetic. He had to deal gently with those who didn't know God's ways. And also he had to be also gentle with the ones who did know God's ways, but was wanting to go away from God's ways or being wayward. They did know the way, but they either ignored the way or they were disobedient. And thirdly, he had to be aware of his own needs, because he was a human like the rest of them. So that's part of his function was, so he acknowledged his own needs, and he had to, before he went, he was able to offer these prayers and sacrifices for the people. He had to pray about his own sin. So he could serve others because he had compassion for them. He was aware of their weaknesses because he like them, was human. So in this picture, we see the high priest carrying out some of his duties in the Holy of Holies, but that was the most holy part of the temple. And as I said before, he was only allowed in this particular part of the temple on one day of the year, this Day of Atonement, when he confessed his own sin and he sought God's atonement, God's forgiveness for the sins of the nation. And Hebrews is all about showing how God's new covenant, his New Testament with people, is superior to the old, and how Jesus' work as a high priest is superior to what had gone before. So the writer says certain things about Jesus. And Jesus actually had 6 qualifications. So they've got 3 more qualifications, I suppose, than the Old Testament priest. So this is what was I read in a commentary I looked at the other day. And these qualifications was somewhat similar, but surpassed what the Old Testament high priest did. Jesus, yes, he had to be appointed by God. He was called by God the Father to fulfill this work. He identified with human need and was, and indeed still is, sympathetic to our needs. And this is what the writer's constantly trying to get across to the people who are receiving this letter. But then this is where the priesthood of Jesus makes a great difference. This is where his priesthood stands in marked contrast to the Old Testament priest, because Jesus was himself victorious over sin. Yes, Hebrews points out, he's tempted in every way, yet without sin. He was fully obedient to what his Father called him to do. which went to the point of his death on the cross. He was willing to die to deliver us from our sin. And that victory which Jesus got, obtained over death, his victory over death, his resurrection, and then his exaltation to God's right hand. And this obviously is relevant to us today, because this is where Jesus is now, interceding, not just on one day of the year, but every day for those who put their trust in him. And so because of these facts, then we, like the ones who received this letter, should be encouraged. The verses that we read earlier on start off by saying, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let's hold fast to our confession. We've commented before about how the writer's concerned about people drifting away, and he's very concerned that they should not do that. Jesus himself is concerned, obviously, that we should hold fast to what we believe. Jesus accomplished what no priest before him could ever accomplish. And in this passage, Jesus is described as a great high priest. His work in interceding between us and God far surpasses what his predecessors were able to do. It's superior in every way. It's superior in its range. It's superior in its nature. And because of Jesus dying on the cross, it's far more far-reaching than the sacrifices offered by the priests in the temple. And it's superior in its effectiveness, because the priest could only pray and pass the sin on to the animals that they were sacrificing, whereas Jesus himself takes the sin upon himself and enables us to walk completely free. And as these other sacrifices were offered on a regular basis, Jesus' sacrifice was one once and for all sacrifice. So Jesus, this anointed one, the Messiah, who's gone through the heavens, is also Jesus the man. There is a man, we read, a man in heaven who understands us. He sympathizes with us. He knows our trials. He's a human priest. But most significantly, he's the Son of God. He's the unique priest. Three elements of supremacy, humanity, deity mark Jesus out as being completely distinct from and superior to what had gone before. Okay, yeah, there were similarities, but Jesus' accomplishments far surpassed those of his predecessors. And so in light of this, the writer again makes a plea to hold fast to the confession of our faith. And then in verse 15, he tells us we've not a high priest who's unable to sympathize with us in our weaknesses. Oh, this is great news, isn't it? Because Jesus was made like us. He experienced life completely. He grew tired. At times we read that he became hungry. He experienced the limitations of living in a human body. He understands our weaknesses. He faced the same temptations we do, yet he didn't sin. That's what we read. So, he might at this point say, well, wait a minute, Jesus never married, so how could he know about the pressures that married couples face? How does he know what it's like to grow old or lose your job? And perhaps a lot of other things that you might think of. Well, yeah, as regards specifics, then you could raise these points, but Jesus is all-knowing. And as a human, Jesus knew what it was to meet temptation and testing. And he came through that victorious. He knew that temptation, when it's not conquered, leads to doubt. And doubt leads to despair. And despair leads to disobedience towards God. So he was the one who, yes, he embodied God and he embodied man, but he was victorious over sin and temptation. So Jesus in his humanity felt the struggle that temptation, the same sort of struggle with temptation that we have, yet he didn't give in. And because of this, he's not only able to sympathize with us, but also to give us power to overcome. So yes, let us come boldly to the throne of grace, into God's very presence. There we read, we will receive his mercy and grace to help us when we need it. Is there ever a time when we're not in need of God's mercy and help? Lev Lee, who wrote the article on the Jews for Jesus website, says this about the Feast of Trumpets, the Rosh Hashanah celebration. I believe the truest fulfillment of this festival is Jesus' offer of the new covenant to all who will receive it. And then he quotes Jesus' words, "This covenant is my blood, which is shed for you." Words which we remember when we take communion. Communion service enables us to acknowledge our need, confess our sin, receive forgiveness and power to overcome sin. And so, when we do take communion, let's enter it in the right attitude, knowing that we have a high priest who understands us, but as well as having the desire to forgive us, also has the power to change us.